Hello, good morning, everyone. We're just starting to let everyone in. Sorry if you can hear that beeping noise as well. We've tried to figure out how to stop it, but might get lots of little pings as people start coming in. Okay. So we'll let people trickle in. We're expecting about 170 people registered for today, which is amazing. So we'll give everyone a chance to join us. But while we do, I'll just do a bit of the standard housekeeping that I'm sure we're all used to on these sessions. So a big good morning. Thank you so much for joining us and taking some time out of your morning today. As you may notice, this session is hosted by Compassionate Employers. We're a workplace program delivered by Hospice UK, which is the national charity for end-of-life care. My name is Faith. I'm going to be hosting this conversation today. I lead the Compassionate Employers program alongside my team. And we're going to kick off with our conversation with our guest today, Nasrin, in just a moment. So do get settled in, get comfortable as we let everyone in and join us. You will notice that mics and cameras have been disabled, at least for the conversation portion of today. We were just chatting before we started. You know, we've all been on those webinars where it can get very distracting. So I hope you appreciate why we've done that. However, you can use the chat to share your thoughts throughout. In fact, it would be really nice for you, as we're doing introductions, for you to do that now. Just let us know where you're joining from today. It would be great to see which organizations have joined us or what roles you may be in. I know when we went through the registration list, there was a whole slew of different organizations, different sectors that have joined us for this conversation, which is amazing. And we do have a Q&A kind of function that's accessible as well, so you can drop in your questions. Feel free to drop those in as we go. We don't have to save them till the end. If we have some great questions, some ones that you really want to ask Nasrin towards the end, we can aim to get to those as well. But without further ado, we're at about 75 people, so let's get into it today. So I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Nasrin Oskui. Nasrin is the Global Head of Wellbeing at Deutsche Bank. I'm sure Deutsche Bank doesn't need too much of an introduction. It's one of the world's leading financial services providers. But some context for Deutsche Bank, if you're not aware, that they do have 89,000 employees. They're operating in 58 countries. So I'm sure you can appreciate why Nasrin has a wealth of knowledge on this topic and why we're so excited to hear her thoughts on this. And since Nasrin took on the role of the Global Head of Wellbeing, she's written and started to implement Deutsche Bank's wellbeing strategy with the goal to make wellbeing part of a sustainable performance culture. And I'm sure we'll get into what that means. And that is so important. So I have some questions that selfishly I'm really keen to get into and learn more about for Nasrin today. And as I said, I'm sure you're really keen to get into them as well and get into this topic. And we have time for those questions later on. So Nasrin, to come to you, firstly, thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your schedule. With that introduction, I'm sure we can all imagine just how busy you are. We're coming off the back of World Mental Health Day. I'm sure you've been busy with lots of things, amazing things for your colleagues. So I'm going to start with one question that brings about the context for today, why you and I in particular are having this conversation and our kind of relationship of working together. So context for those that are listening in, Deutsche Bank did join Compassionate Employers in January of this year. So to start with, can you just give us a sense of explain why adding a program like Compassionate Employers was important for your overall wellbeing strategy?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you all for being here. I hope it's going to be a worthwhile hour for you all to talk about my favorite topic, well-being. So, Faith, when we met, I was absolutely sold from the very first moment on the Compassionate Employers program. I'm going to tell you why. So, as you said, our goal is to make well-being part of our everyday culture. And for that, we have made 5 choices. And one of the most important choices is behavioral change. That always sounds very complex, right? But what we mean with that is that we want to empower and enable our employees to understand, A, how to prioritize their own well-being, but also how to look after their colleagues as a manager or as a colleague. And we've got a very special focus on managers and later on in the conversation, I'm sure we're going to talk more about it, the manager's role during a bereavement, for example. And we do see them as our culture accelerators. They are in the teams. They see how their people are, right? So it's incredibly important that we support them and educate them, that we give them everything, all the tools, all the well-being toolbox they need, that they can work with their team, so they can support their team and that they can also look after their own well-being. And they need to understand that they have to lead with empathy, and that they need to create a psychological safe environment where people feel safe to open up. And that's incredibly important. And for that, we also explain the why very often to our managers. We also looked at well-being drivers, right? What does employee well-being mean? And I think it's not a secret, the well-being drivers are not only illness or stress at work, it's life cycle events that all of us experience all the time in our lifetime, right? And for example, going through a divorce, struggling with fertility, moving to another country, and of course, bereavement. And bereavement and grief is so complex. It impacts people extremely differently. There is no one size fits all. But what is certain is that we will all bring our grief with us to work. And that's our role as an employer, that we can support our colleagues during this time, right? And with the Compassionate Employers Program, to come back to your question, we want to really enable our colleagues, our managers, our HR partners on how to have those bereavement conversations, for example. I think we've all been there, right? So someone tells us, my mother passed suddenly away, right? And you're lost for words. You don't know what to say. And then we are so nervous about maybe saying the wrong thing. And then we don't say nothing at all. And there's nothing worse you can do than not saying anything, right? So we really need to enable our colleagues on how to have those conversations. And you've got brilliant learnings on that hub, for example, right? You can inform yourself about grief. You can, there are resources on where to get support. There's a wealth of information, research, videos, and knowledge is power, right, during this time. Also for the grieving person, it's okay that I feel this way. It's absolutely normal. And there are other people out there that are grieving like I do as well. So it's a brilliant, brilliant program.
Yeah. I mean, we're so happy to have you. I think where we really aligned as well, what was really clear in those conversations is a lot of the things that you've just touched on is that, this idea that people will leave that at home, or it doesn't affect them at work, or if you're a really ambitious organization that really wants to be successful and efficient, then you're going to need support to support people through those moments, not just bereavement like we focus on, but the things that you've mentioned, divorces, difficult things going on in their lives, or just practical logistic things. You work and you operate in many, many countries. I'm sure people are kind of moving around and have different kind of needs at those times as well. Which I think kind of nicely brings us to my next question for you, which is, you're a global head of wellbeing. I think that part of your title is really important. As I say, you're a massive organization, many, many employees. So I'm sure a lot of people would be interested listening in. Maybe they're a similar size, or maybe they're even a smaller business that's just curious how this works at such a big scale. So as a global organization like Deutsche Bank, how are you adapting that well-being support to meet the needs of different groups, whether that's different age groups? We're having lots of conversations in well-being about kind of generational divides, or kind of what do Gen Z need, and that's been a big conversation, but also things like different cultures, different career stages, like you mentioned, when someone becomes a manager. I think different practices that people have can be so important. So on a kind of bigger scale, but if we want to come back to bereavement, we can as well. But how are you doing that, Nasrin, in such a big organization? I think that's the main question for you.
It's incredibly complex and it's not easy, but that's where our second strategic choice comes from. So we are saying we are democratizing well-being. We are not doing well-being at people, we are doing it with them. So as you said, we are in 58 countries, right? So we are working with stakeholders in all the regions. right? So one example is that we have rolled out a mental health campaign in China this year, at the beginning of the year. I couldn't have done that because I have absolutely no idea, right, what language you can use, where we are with stigma, what we can talk about, what we can't talk about, right? And that's why we worked with different employees in China to understand what works, right? And together we did build the campaign, and it was hugely successful. And they're now talking about mental health. You just have to start, but the important thing is that you really include all the stakeholders across, in our case, the bank, right? So as you say, different generations, regional stakeholders, employees, managers, senior leaders, all of them across the world, regions, and also include benefits teams, health and safety, employee networks. We have so many employee networks, mental health first aiders. We've got over 700 mental health first aiders, individuals who want to help their colleagues, right? Learning and development, because we are plugging well-being into all our learning offerings, right? People strategies, and the list goes on. So it's really important to take all of those stakeholders with you, and then really live by the motto that no one size fits all. You have to think about it, but then it works, right? Invest a little bit of time, do your research, talk to people, and then it will be successful. We also have to think about how we reach those people, right? Because in Germany and Europe, we've got branches. So it's people who are not desk-based. They're not going to read emails. So how do we reach those people? So we also have to think about not only what is the content of the communication, how do we reach those people? It's complex, but it's doable. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be a lot of people, and maybe there'll be questions. Those of you who are just joining us, we do have a Q&A function if you want to get into any more details about what Nasrin is discussing, because I think that's the big one that we get, like you say, people that are in branches, people that are in retail stores. How do you reach those people? I mean, we've worked with companies where some employees don't have an email address, for example. So if your entire communication strategy is via email, then you're missing a big chunk of those people. But I think the common thread of what you've touched on, as you say, it's complex. You're talking about a lot of different countries, cultures, even, is that it's not that one size fits all approach. I think you have a really good understanding of the differences and the efforts that you're going to need to make, right? What you're talking about there is that time and that investment to get those things right, rather than having a blanket approach to a global company and then seeing some places where that really thrives and some places where it's maybe not the right approach. So thinking about that kind of engagement, I think a lot of people would be interested to know more about what's been successful and how that's been successful, because that's probably what they're hoping to get out of today or maybe replicate today. So I mean, I know just from working with you, even in just within this year, that Deutsche Bank employees, they have a really high level of engagement in wellbeing initiatives. And I know that because you mentioned our hub, for example, that has some really great resources on there. We track the usage of that. Deutsche Bank, almost every single time we track it, I think, especially in the last few kind of campaigns and different things we've done together, is the most engaged of all of the members that we work with. I think that's representative of the work you do in terms of creating a culture of engagement, but also that we came together at the right time, that there was clearly a need for it and a desire for more resources on that. So what strategies have you found to be most effective in maintaining that engagement? And for those listening in, I'm sure that's why they'd love to hear from you today, and why we're having this conversation is, how do you think that they can replicate that success? What do you think are the components of really engaged employees? Because you've been successful in this. Unfortunately, it's not always the case that we may have really great intentions and great resources behind it, but it just doesn't land how people may be hoping.
I think the most important decision was where well-being sits at Deutsche Bank, right? So we are part of the people experience and sustainable culture team. So we sit in the culture team where we look at purpose, where we look at culture, where we look at D&I, where we look at ESG, right? All those topics that are very closely connected, but it's culture. In a lot of companies, you see well-being still in the benefits teams or in the D&I team or in even health and safety where it really, really shouldn't sit, I think, right? But that's how the setup normally is. And I think all of those topics are part of well-being, but well-being shouldn't sit there because it's about our culture, right? How we are working with each other, how we lead, how we manage, how we work with each other, and also how we are working. Smart work is a big topic at the moment, right? And I would say as a second point is that we have built a top of the house engagement model. You need your senior leaders to buy in, right? That means we have a global well-being sponsor in our management board, Fabrizio, and he is an extremely authentic well-being sponsor. He has spoken about bereavement. He has spoken about how the sudden death of a friend has really absolutely impacted him. He couldn't function anymore for a month, and how he got out of it. He shared that story. He showed vulnerability. He did send a message, it's okay not to be okay. And then when John Blocks on the trading floor maybe sees, oh wow, Fabrizio's talking about bereavement, he's talking about the loss, and he's talking about how it has impacted his work, then I can talk about it. And that is key. Without it, I think it's always going to be a initiative rather than a culture change, right? And that is so important. We've gone one step further in every, so we've got different divisions across the globe, and in every global divisional leadership team, we've got a well-being champion. So they are inviting me, for example, to global town halls, right? So well-being is an agenda item before a business update and a business outlook. It's just in there, not for mental health week, during a normal town hall, and that's how it should be. It is a topic that is relevant. They do send out emails, for example, for me when we're running communication campaigns. They are sending the emails out because people often don't read emails that are coming from HR. Fact. Right? So leverage your leaders to send out communications. People will be more likely to read them, and communicate regular. Really, it's not only World Mental Health Week where you should communicate. It's really throughout the year, because we have well-being all the time. Right. So we really need to hear about it all the time. And we do have really regular initiatives. We have got lots of campaigns. Yeah. So that's what we are doing. We are, as I said, we are engaging with a lot of people. We are making them part of it. They are spreading the word. They're hosting. So, for example, all our volunteers, their well-being forums. We have a brilliant bereavement group. There is a fertility support group. We've got a really active neurodiversity network, and the list goes on and on and on. So there are so many colleagues who just want to give back and who want to be involved. Leverage them, work with them. And create transparency. That is super important, because so many companies have so much on offer and people don't know about it. They don't know where to find it. They don't know what it is. EAP is the best example, right? So people always say, I'll call the EAP. And you see like a big question mark on their faces, right? And it's no one, asks what it is, and no one knows what it is. So explain what an EAP is, right? So we have created, you mentioned it before, the Global Wellbeing Hub. It's as a one-stop solution for well-being. With 2 clicks, you get to any information you need. So we've got a global page where you can really inform yourself. We have TED Talks on there. We've got research on there, a lot of information, symptoms. So what is anxiety? What is a depression? What is perimenopause? What is neurodiversity? Understanding what it is, right? Because often we don't want to ask. So give them the knowledge, right? Give them the information they need. And then they can go to their regional pages where they see all the benefits, where they see the EAP. The EAP is explained, it's a 24/7 hotline where you can call, etc. And that's also where our Compassionate Employers program sits, right? Under bereavement. So you can go on there and you find it with one click. And we've created a manager wellbeing hub with talking points, with special guides for manager on how to support their employees during a difficult time. And we are also measuring because senior management wants to see measuring, right? And we want to understand what goes well and what doesn't go well. So, start measuring, look into it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. My mind is kind of going off in lots of different directions of what I could pick up on that. But I think the key thing that's coming out of that for me is a very collaborative approach. Like you say, I mean, we were chatting just before we kind of started to let people trickle in about this, this term of kind of well-being washing, or, these events that you mentioned. I even was just saying this at an event earlier in the week, I think the reaction to that can be so different depending on what you're doing the other 364 days a year, or 51 weeks a year, whatever it may be. But, the difference of that often comes down to, is this something that I feel like is being done to me, as you mentioned earlier? Or is there something that, I believe my organization is doing year round, but this is just an opportunity to put a real spotlight on the menopause or on infertility or on men's mental health, for example. It's not that this is the only time we talk about it, but we want to give it a platform. And I think that was even something that came up as we were planning this session. Even a couple of your colleagues wrote on my post promoting the session saying, I'm so glad Nasrin is talking about this, or, Nasrin is the perfect person to talk about this because you and your team and the leaders in the business, it's not just talk. And I think those things that you mentioned, getting leaders to send the messages or having them talk about their own experiences, it's vulnerable, and it is a big ask in some cases for leaders. But I think it makes people feel like, we're not just doing this to kind of tick a box, and we talk about kind of tick box well-being a lot. So I think that's really important. And the measuring part as well, maybe there's other questions that people might have on that, so please do send them in terms of just knowing where you are, and even things like, what we're doing with you of tracking when people are going into our resources, for example, what pages are they looking at? Stuff like that is so important. If you see a massive spike in people looking for bereavement support, for example, that would be, a conversation for us to have together and say, should we be doing something else around this?
Absolutely.
So that brings me to a question kind of specifically on that grief support, I think. So, I mean, we do lots of research. We obviously hear this anecdotally quite a lot. One of the stats that I think really maybe shocks some people, maybe doesn't. It definitely wasn't too shocking for us, but we did some research about 2 years ago now that showed that half of employees would consider leaving their jobs if they didn't get the kind of proper support they were expecting during a bereavement. Going back to our conversation about different kind of generations and age groups, that jumps all the way up to 77% if it's the 18 to 34-year-olds. So, I mean, you touched on some of the things that has helped you at Deutsche Bank, obviously things like partnering with us at Compassionate Employers, your colleagues talking about their experience of bereavement. But in your experience overall, what support, particularly around bereavement, has been the most impactful or beneficial for employees? What are you hearing from them is helpful? And that could be the managers as well. We've touched on managers, but what are the things that you're seeing around bereavement that are really making the impact?
You know what, for me, it's really all about the manager, to be honest. So we do have bereavement leave. There's everything there, what most companies also offer. But having the psychological safe environment where you can have an open conversation with your manager about your loss, and where the manager says, don't worry about anything, I've got your back, the manager and the team. Because in times of grief, you don't want to feel bad that that you can't function, that you can't do your work. You don't want to get calls the whole time that when you're coming back, etc. Family comes first, and you just want to know that they've got you, and it makes such a difference. I've heard stories from both sides, and it makes such a difference. And then managers, of course, educate them then that they can signpost as well, right? To the EAP, for example, or to the compassionate employers hub. So it's really the all the resources we have available that you make them easily accessible. But the most important thing is to know that your firm has your back. Makes
Mhm.
such a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it comes back to that conversation, right? Of, what are we saying and what are we doing? So I think,
Mm,
obviously we hear the stories as well from both sides, which is, maybe they go out and they say something, or maybe they've even done something like National
mm,
Grief Awareness Week, which is coming up, which we'll be doing lots around, or Carers Week, for example. But then when you actually sit down and have the conversation with the manager, it's like you say, it's when you're coming back, or oh, it's not a great time for you to take that carer's leave because we
yeah,
have a massive project. So it's kind of saying something, but then the feeling that you get or the culture that we're
yeah,
talking about is very different. So
yeah,
those things have to kind of match up for us to have that real, genuine, kind of supportive, compassionate
yeah.
workplace that we're looking for. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And the managers are such a big piece. I mean, we have those conversations a lot. I think managers have a really tough time. I really feel
Mm-hmm,
for managers, especially the ones that don't have the support in place that you have,
mm-hmm,
because it can be just a minefield. It can be really confusing to know, we send managers out with these big expectations,
mm-hmm,
and then they don't necessarily have the resources to support
mm-hmm,
them through that.
mm-hmm,
And you've obviously, invested in that. You have lots of resources in there, but
mm-hmm,
I imagine that there might be people on here often when our community comes together like this. The people that are here get it. Maybe they've had a bereavement experience themselves,
mm-hmm,
or they're really passionate about this in their workplace. But I think a lot of the people on this call, maybe some leaders or kind of employees themselves that are listening in, they might be facing that resistance from leadership when trying to invest in grief support or mental health support, which we're kind of going back and forth between today. So you've obviously had that investment. I mean, you're the global head of wellbeing, so I imagine you have quite a bit of authority on these things as well. But what advice would you give to wellbeing leaders who are really passionate about this topic? I mean, our community is amazing in terms of they understand why this is important. We're preaching to the choir constantly, but
mm-hmm,
they may get pushback. Budgets are tight at the moment, or we keep seeing well-being kind of being pushed down on the agenda. So what
mm-hmm,
advice would you give to those people listening in that may not need a lot of convincing from us, but they're trying to convince people maybe higher up on the chain
mm-hmm,
to recognize the importance of something like this, and why an investment in this would be important?
mm-hmm. Invest time in explaining, because as you say, we are all subject matter experts. We are very close to the topic. We are passionate about it, but explain it to someone who maybe hasn't engaged with the topic before, right? Actively. So you have to make sure to explain that providing well-being and mental health support is not only the right thing to do, that it is a business imperative. I think you have to make the business case and take some data with you into the conversations. You don't need your own data because it's quite tricky. But there are brilliant well-being reports or from Deloitte, from McKinsey. McKinsey even has a health institute now that shows how important it is, right? And
Hmm.
what the business case is there. Gallup, etc. You can download those reports for free. And there you will see data, how much ill well-being costs firms every year, right? Come up with some stats, take them with you into the conversation. And I think as a second point, you have to really explain what well-being is, right? Because it does sound quite complex. Some people think of a bit of yoga and mindfulness, right? But that's not what we mean. That's great. I love mindfulness and yoga, but we mean culture change, right? And it's not only depression and anxiety, it's also life cycle events that can impact our mental health that we are taking with us to work. And that's important. And 1 in 4 people will be impacted by mental health challenges. 25%. Can we really ignore 25% of our population? I think we can't. And then it's important work with positive psychology, because when people are happy and when they're healthy, then and when they feel seen, heard, and valued, oh my God, they're going to be productive, they're going to be creative, they're going to stay longer in the firm, and it's going to be a lot more fun to work with them, right? So that's important. Make the case, explain it like that. And I think then people can't really say no anymore.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you put the numbers in front of people, it is very hard to dispute, especially, some of the research that you mentioned there, McKinsey, Deloitte, Gallup, all of this, hard data. It's not just kind of this, I think grief and bereavement for a long time, unfortunately, was kind of seen as this nice to have or something that you did kind of if you could. I think we're seeing it jump up in the priorities in terms of, it's something that you need to have in place. As you say, 1 in 4 people will have be affected by mental health, but we also know that at any point, 1 in 4 people are affected at some level by a bereavement, whether it's someone in their household who's been bereaved or just the kind of aftermath of a long-term, the long-term kind of impact of bereavement. So yeah, I think that's kind of, massively important. And I will say, if there's anyone out there that is looking for that support, we're always happy to get in the trenches with you as well. So you can reach out to us if you're trying to convince someone in your organization, or you just need a bit of support or backup. We're always happy to come armed with, our evidence and research, whether anecdotal or kind of that hard data that we're talking about as well. And I think, just from our work, I think when we look at this as something like a business problem, or tackle it like a typical business problem, ironically, I think all the things that we're worried about happening if we give people that support, so they'll have to take lots of time off, or it's going to be a big business cost, or it's going to derail the efficiency of the team, we actually see the opposite. So the organizations where people are forced back into work, or when they're not ready, or when they're ignored by their colleagues, that actually has that effect that you're so nervous about creating, which is they tend to leave the organization, or if they do show up, they're not productive. You have that presenteeism. Yes, they may be at their desk or on a call, but they're not really there with you. So I think you've touched on quite a few times this idea of investment, of the time that it takes to invest in these things. And I think it might not seem really clear in those first few weeks or even months what the output of this is, but long term, you're going to get, as you say, that person that feels valued and seen, and they may take a little bit of time to recover from that bereavement, but long term, what you hear is people like the colleagues that reached out to me and said, Nasrin really gets this. She gets the long-term vision of it. And yes, people might not get it in the beginning, but I'm sure in the long term, you'll see those results that you're looking for. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're just at 1:30. I'm sure there may be some questions coming through, so I will try and leave some time for those ones as well. But the last kind of big question before I ask you your kind of final thoughts before we wrap up is, kind of touching on what I've seen, at least as we've been, promoting this session, or even just seeing you promoting it to your network. If you don't follow Nasrin on LinkedIn, go do that after this, because she's constantly posting lots of great gems and things that I'm sure you would find really interesting. And you've been a very vocal advocate for opening up conversations about mental health and grief in the workplace, which we definitely appreciate. And that's something that seems to come quite naturally to you, to be a leader in this space, to be someone that talks about it. But we've seen that shift quite a bit, I think, especially on platforms like LinkedIn, or, as you mentioned, your colleagues who are leaders in the organization talking about their own experience. So why do you think it's crucial or so important for leaders to start to have these conversations? And I guess, what would your advice be to, there may be people on this call who are in similar roles, or might be leaders in their organizations, who realize that it's important to start up these conversations, but aren't necessarily sure how to get started. So if someone was looking to have a platform like you, or be leading conversations like this, like we're doing today, where would you advise that they start? Because it might seem a little bit intimidating to some people to start to talk about mental health or grief, or start to be an authority on this. So I'd be really curious to hear what your experience has been on that, or maybe what advice you would give to other people.
So what was a real eye-opener for me is when I took on the role. and I wanted to get a status quo. What is well-being? What do people at Deutsche Bank feel what well-being is, right? And I had around 400 interviews with different stakeholders across the globe, different corporate titles, different seniority titles, different divisions. Super interesting. At the beginning, everyone was like, well-being, I mean, there were people that were very positive and there were people who were skeptical, rightly so, because it was a new topic, right? So I scheduled every conversation for 30 minutes. Every single conversation went over those 30 minutes. Do you know why? Because everyone has experience with their own well-being or other people's well-being at work. It's relevant. When you think about it, what does well-being mean, right? What is it? It's how we feel. How we can we bring our whole selves to work? Or do I need to leave everything at home, everything that I'm going through? Can I have an open conversation? Does my manager show interest in me? Does he know who I am? It's just so relevant to create like this positive and engaged working environment to talk about things, to see the real person behind the employee, right? The human being. And that is so important. And it's so much more fun when we see the whole human being behind the employee, right? So we need to really destigmatize the conversation around mental health. Storytelling is a great measure if you want to start. Um, there's so many employees who want to tell their story and who want to tell their colleagues what they've done to get better. There are so many inspiring stories, and you don't always need to get this super expensive whatever athlete in who talks about their mental health journey. Also super interesting. If you have the budget, great. But work with your employees. That's so important. Make it normal. We come to work and say, "Oh, I've broken my arm at tennis." Why can't you come and say, "I'm sad, my mother passed away"? What is, and also take the fear away of showing vulnerability. It's not weak, it's strong, right? It's not a weakness. What would people say if you say I'm really suffering because my mother died? What do people expect? Everybody would show empathy, right? But it needs both. It needs the leaders and the managers to create this environment where we really promote that it's okay not to be okay. That is super important that you have that. But then, and I think we forget this very often, it's so important that we encourage employees that they need to ask for help and that they need to open up, because sometimes you don't see the symptoms, we always talk about when someone is not well. Sometimes we don't see it because some people can really mask it well, right? So we really need to encourage people to open up, to share some of the key things that are going on in their life. There's one example I can give you. A few years back, there was a team and manager, employee, and the employee was always late. It was a trading floor, so it's quite important that you're on time there. Manager was quite, he was getting more angry every day the employee came in late. And then finally, after 6 months, they had a conversation. Why? And then it came out that the employee had caring responsibilities and had to wait for the nurse to arrive at home to take over. And they were always late. If they would have had that conversation before, I mean, yeah, I don't have to go there, right? And that's why it's so important. Bring the human being to work. Let's work with each other. Let's be open to each other. Let's talk about challenges and problems so we can support each other. Only then we can support each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, this idea that yeah, as you say, the average person, every single one of us will have a story, whether that's our bereavement story, whether it's our mental health story. And yeah, it's amazing when we get these speakers in who are Olympians or CEOs or whatever it may be, that those stories are really powerful as well. But I think the average person just really wants to hear from another parent in their organization, another carer, someone else who's been through a bereavement. And I mean, I've seen it in the work that we do, the connections that those people make. You talked about a lot of the networks that you have, neurodiversity networks, for example. I'm sure the success of that is not a coincidence, because being with people who are going through something similar or can really understand you, like you say, being seen, being heard, is so powerful in a workplace. Being able to show up and feel that your colleagues really understand what you're going through. So yeah, I think that's makes complete sense that we should incorporate those people as well. It doesn't have to just be those leaders or external speakers. It could be the person that sits next to you that I'm sure has a really compelling, interesting story, if we just ask them about it. And I think what you're talking about there as well is a bit of the story that you mentioned, that 6 months that's gone by. Could have been prevented, like you say, maybe a conversation earlier. But I think also there's a real fear around reaching out to someone if we think that they're struggling, that we're going to kind of offend them or invade their kind of personal boundaries or whatever it may be. But I think we can take the fear out of those conversations as well. It can just be very light touch. I may be completely off the mark, and tell me if I am, but I've noticed that you're a little bit withdrawn lately. Is there anything that we can chat about? It doesn't have to be this serious, sit down, quite intense conversation. So as you say, the more that we're having that, though, the less scary it gets.
Absolutely.
So a final question for you, because I can see that we've got lots of ones coming in the Q&A, and I'm sure Lucy will kind of filter those through in a moment. But so a final question for you. I mean, we've touched on so much, and again, we're so grateful for your time, Nasrin, and for you going into all the kind of details of this. But for employers, employees, anyone who's watching this webinar or maybe watching it back later, what would you suggest as a first step that they can take to becoming a more compassionate employer? Some of this might seem they may be on the journey with you, they may be just at the beginning of the journey. What would you tell them in terms of that first step that they can take?
Understand where you are. I think that is super important, because most people just start and don't understand really what's out there already, what works, what doesn't work. Status quo is incredibly important. Start destigmatizing the conversation around mental health. Try to get senior leaders involved. Try to get your networks involved. Make it normal to communicate. It's okay not to be okay throughout the year. Communicate throughout the year. Talk about it. Integrate it into everything you're doing. If you have a new manager program or if you have other development opportunities, plug well-being into it. It's really not hard. Explain the why employee well-being is so important. And I think the last advice is really be patient. Culture change can take up to 7 years. You're not going to see change overnight. And yeah, that's it really.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important kind of note for us to end on, because I think you're a huge organization. You've obviously invested a lot of time, and I think it might people might look at where you are in terms of what you have available and the engagement that you've had, and feel like that feels quite far away for them. But I think that that investment, that time, that patience is a really nice place for us to finish, which is that it doesn't have to be all of those things immediately. It could be that first step. Where are we? Let's check in with our colleagues. Let's, something similar to what you did, going out to those 400 people might not be realistic, but maybe it's going out to 10 people or 20 people and just starting to have those conversations. So baby steps. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's it for my my kind of questions that I wanted to get through. Thank you. Please do feel free to start dropping any into the Q&A. I can see that we've had a couple already. Before we do get into any final questions, because I know people might want to start hopping off after the question section, I did just want to, forgive me, do a blatant plug, if you will, go there with me, which is, I think it nicely kind of brings us on in terms of this next step, which is that we have a major awareness week coming up for this very shortly at the beginning of December, and we're doing a lot of work within our team. Lucy, who is on the call today, who's going to be doing some fantastic sessions throughout that week. So I just wanted to give you a chance, if you are interested in doing something like this in your organization, or you're looking for that first step. I'll just pop this up for a moment for you while we start to go through this Q&A, this is a really kind of easy form that you can scan here today, and we'll send it out afterwards as well, which is if you're looking for some extra support during that National Grief Awareness Week at the beginning of December, our team is on hand to support you. And members, people like Deutsche Bank, some of the other organizations we work with, Aviva, Co-op, will all be getting lots of support during that week from us. So you're welcome to join them in getting that support for that really important week. But Lucy, do we want to start funneling in if we've had any questions off the cuff?
Really, yeah, thanks so much, Nasrin. That was really helpful. And it's always fascinating to hear, especially from such a large organization. It's so funny how similar those things are in the smaller organizations that we work with as well. It's such a kind of universal experience, isn't it? One of the big things that's come through in a couple of different questions has been around that kind of actually measuring that success. So if you've got any kind of tangible reporting styles that's really helpful for you to be able to showcase to senior leadership, other board members or trustees, just to show the importance of actually investing in wellbeing products and a comprehensive wellbeing strategy.
We're looking into absence data. We have opinion-led data from our people survey. There are well-being questions in there, also around psychological safety. How safe do you feel talking to your manager about mental health, etc. We measure, so how many people are on the Wellbeing Hub, for example. We have 100,000 visits a month. That shows there is demand, which is great. We can also measure which topics are extremely important at the moment, and that gives us a good insight what is going on at the moment. We look at our EAP uptake. We do get quite good reports. Of course, everything is anonymous, but we see why people are calling. So just an overarching theme. And then we can, again, tailor make content for, the top theme, for example. So those are like the key measurements we are doing. But of course, it's tricky because it's confidential data. So it's you can never go into a lot of detail, but that helps for a start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose for people who are working on a much smaller level, so that they might not have that kind of vast amount of data, actually measuring well-being can be really tricky when you've got a smaller sample size. So, but I do think, data, being data driven is a really big focus, isn't it? And that's just collecting what you can, where you can, will be a great way to kind of build a base. A couple of people have kind of mentioned around, how do people who are in roles like yourself, who are leading in these sort of well-being sectors, how do you protect your own well-being? It's great that you're how do you practice what you preach? How do you make sure that you're practicing those
well,
those
it's
issues yourself?
it's a huge advantage, right, being a well-being leader, because you've got a wealth of information and access to all the information. So I really, what I'm doing is really doing the regular breaks to, go for a walk. For example, what I've learned a lot and what I'm dealing with is a circle of control and influence, right? Don't get wound up about things you can't change anyway, but change the things you can do. And we are all responsible for our own well-being, and we forget that often. You often hear people say, oh, the firm or the company should do it. No. It's your well-being, and you're responsible for creating your day, to designing your day, to design how you work, how many meetings you attend. If you think a meeting is necessary, for example, say, I don't think we need this meeting. Can we do this with an email, for example? I have a great relationship with my manager. I share when I'm struggling, when I have too much stress, and I've got a good private life. So I've got a supporting partner and a lovely cockapoo Snoopy who lights up my day every day. So
dogs are great therapy.
They're the best therapy.
Yeah, I think it's very important, highlighting that, having that personal toolkit is super important, as well as, taking those regular breaks and things as well. One of the questions is, what is the most important approach, and how do we approach really difficult and topics around sort of end of life or bereavement? As we know, it's not something that we talk about very often in society. It's something that we shy away from as a society. So, have you come up with any kind of tools to help introduce these conversations and open up those conversations within the workplace?
well, you have come up with the tool because it's your tool. So you have got brilliant e-learnings, for example. And what I love about those are that they're tailor-made for employees, for managers, for HR business partners. So how can we support each other? How can a manager support their team member? How can HR support the team and the manager? And that is so important, right? So just enabling people and giving them knowledge and power to have and to feel confident to have those conversations. It's so important, just to understand that, there are things you can do wrong, but saying nothing is not acceptable. So, you get so much wealth of information out of those trainings. I just encourage everyone to have that in their company, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's having that knowledge there, isn't it? Especially because we're so shy as a society to talk about these things. Actually, kind of normalizing that conversation at work goes part of the way to changing the way that as a society we actually are having those conversations.
Yeah.
Louise has asked a really interesting question that it is something that we hear about quite often is that, grief is not linear. It might not be that somebody feels that impact immediately. It can be things that go on for weeks and months, and those those long-term effects can come up for years and years to come. So how do you as an organization support people through that whole, their whole life cycle whilst they're working with you? Those sorts of how do you support people whilst those things might be coming up for them?
Well, I think it's really through all the initiatives we are doing, and it's not just for bereavement, but it's just getting the support for bereavement and other life cycle events in your life, right? It's the manager enablement, it's the constant communication that it's okay not to be okay. It's providing the resources that are available, that you can reach out to anytime, and it's having bereavement groups as well. People really, I hear so often how helpful a bereavement group within the firm is, talking to colleagues about bereavement and how it has impacted them, because they know the culture in the firm, they know what's going on. So it just helps, right? And I think, again, that doesn't cost anything, right? Having a bereavement group. So important, and give them the tools like the compassionate employers program. Give them the tools, give them information, give them that they have always access to. I think it's so important for people to understand I'm not alone. It's completely normal how I'm feeling. That is so important. You get that through that. Yeah.
That power of connection is something that we talk about quite a lot. And actually it does help with that vulnerability. You shared a bit about I can't remember his name, sorry, your sponsor who shared so openly and vulnerably, and actually, sometimes sharing that vulnerability creates an environment for others to be able to do that, and those networks do bring a massive benefit in that sense. The last question is from Jennifer, and it was, what were your biggest barriers? What are the biggest barriers that you faced in terms of creating a culture where vulnerability is okay?
Well, starting, I think, because the role didn't really exist in October 21, right? It was a blank canvas, and really, how do I start? How do I convince people? And it's really just a convincing piece. But when you piece all the puzzle pieces together, it makes so much sense that you have such a compelling case. I think that was it.
It is quite often the case that as soon as you start having these conversations, the penny drops and people go, actually, I've felt like this before, or my colleague has, and I've supported somebody through this, and it's really important, and it hits a chord with all of us personally. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nasrin. Those are all of our questions that we've had through the chat. So
wonderful.
Unless there's anything else that anybody wants to add on, I will pass back to you, Faith.
Thank you, Lucy. I think this is a great time to wrap up. In the interest of well-being, we're giving you a couple of minutes back, so you can, hopefully you're going to, sorry, I saw that there was a hand there, but I think we are going to wrap up. If you do have any other questions, we'll send out some information afterwards. You're welcome to feed any questions through to us that way. But just a massive thank you, firstly, to Nasrin. Again, having you on here, your expertise, your knowledge has been so interesting. I've learned a lot. I'm sure other people have as well. Please feel free to feed in your thanks and your appreciation to Nasrin in the chat so that we can pass that on. I have also seen that, Derek, it is your birthday today, so happy birthday. You've popped that in the chat as well. And thank you all so much for joining. We'll give you a bit of time back. As I've mentioned, we'll send out a bit of information after today, some FAQ, some information about how to get involved with us. As I've mentioned, Lucy is doing some fantastic sessions during National Grief Awareness Week. I really encourage you to think about, can that be your first step, your next step into incorporating this support into your workplace. But we will leave it there. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nasrin.